The UFC are coming back to the UK in March 2025 with a UFC Fight Night card at the O2 Arena. 6 fights are already booked for the event. Why not book the other 6? We'll try doing that right here on the RDX Sports Podcast. Welcome everyone. My name is Simon Head and this is the RDX Sports Podcast. The UFC's 2024 schedule is now in the books with UFC Tampa this past weekend, closing out the schedule for the year, and now thoughts are already turning towards what's coming down the line in 2025. And for us here in the UK, that's March the 22nd, O2 Arena, London, England, playing host to a UFC Fight Night event in the capital with 6 fights already booked for that particular event. We'll run down those fights here on the podcast to break those down, but also with 6 fights on the card already, we need probably another 6 as well to round out that fight card. So let's do a bit of fantasy matchmaking right here on the RDX Sports Podcast. All right, let's kick things off by looking at the 6 fights that we already know will be on the fight card on March the 22nd. Just running down the card, we have a huge fight at light heavyweight. Jan Blachowicz versus Carlos Ulberg. Former champion Jan Blachowicz has been there or thereabouts at the top of the 205-pound division for years now. One of only 2 men to take Alex Pereira the distance in his entire career. And that was actually his last fight back in the summer of 2023. Jan Blachowicz has been out of action since then. He comes back for the March 22nd card in London, and he's taking on one of the most red-hot, in-form fighters in the division. Carlos Ulberg is now on a 7-fight win streak. He lost his UFC debut to Kennedy and Nzechukwu, but since then, it's been all wins for Blackjack Carlos Ulberg, and he looked outstanding last time out against Volkan Ozdemir as he picked up his latest victory in Macau at UFC Fight Night just earlier this month. Big fight for Ulberg. If he wins this one, he's right in there as a legit contender at 205 pounds. For Jan Blachowicz, he needs to turn back the challenge of this surgy contender and prove that he is still very much one of the men to beat at the top of the light heavyweight division. And if he can get a finish, then I think a championship fight might not be out of the question for him later in the year. The 205-pound division is absolutely wide open. A big win for either man could push them right into championship contention. That fight is locked and loaded for London on March the 22nd, and it should be an absolute banger. Where that sits in the card will depend on some of these other bouts that are likely to get added to the card further down the line. I would imagine that's kind of a co-main event kind of fight, maybe third fight from the top of the card. What we do know is that it's a huge fight at 205 pounds, and we're going to get it here in London on the 22nd of March. Also on the fight card, already booked, a couple of Brits looking to bounce back from recent defeats at UFC 304 in Manchester. Former Cage Warriors middleweight champion Christian Leroy Duncan lost out to Gregory Robocop Rodriguez in Manchester earlier this year. He's looking to bounce back against Contender Series graduate and UFC debutant Andrey Pulayev, who is stepping in after earning his way into the UFC's middleweight roster with a decision win on Dana White's Contender Series. We all know what Christian Leroy Duncan loves to do. He loves to stand and strike. He's got that very languid sort of fighting style, training under the legendary Mark the Wizard Weir, UK MMA legend. Can he turn his form back around, bounce back from that decision loss to Gregory Rodriguez? Can he get the win against a guy making his UFC debut? I think this is a fight that's really been set for Duncan to kind of turn the ship around and bounce his way back into form. And it's a similar situation with Meatball Molly McCann. She lost out to Bruna Brazil in Manchester earlier this year. She was gutted to lose that one. However, she has the opportunity to bounce back on March the 22nd against a fighter who is absolutely desperate for a win. Istela Nunes is a former atomweight title challenger in one championship, but in the UFC, she cannot buy a victory. This is going to be her 5th appearance in the UFC. She has lost all 4 of her fights so far under the UFC banner. This is a really important fight for Istela Nunes. She's going to be going all guns blazing to try and turn that form around. As for Molly McCann, she's going to be absolutely all guns blazing herself, looking to turn her form around and to get a win on home soil and kick off 2025 on a positive note. Big fight for both women, but you would have to say that Meatball Molly McCann will be a decent-sized favourite for that matchup. Also on the fight card, a heavyweight bout. Marcin Tybura, perennial heavyweight contender, perennial ranked heavyweight. And the term gatekeeper is sometimes considered a little bit derogatory. I don't think it is for Marcin Tybura. He kind of is the gatekeeper of the UFC heavyweight division. If you can get through him, you know that you're a legit contender in that upper weight class in the UFC. He's alternated wins and losses over his last 5 fights, but the 2 losses that he's had during that time are against Sergey Spivak, who is a handful for anybody at heavyweight, and a certain gentleman by the name of Tom Aspinall. Anyone know what's happened to him? Oh yeah, he's the interim champion and probably the greatest heavyweight in the world right now. So Marcin Tybura is a legit talent at heavyweight. He has wins over Ivanov, Tuivasa and Jonata Deniz last time out. He's now going to look to turn back the undefeated test of Mick Parkin, who is taking an enormous step up in class to take on Marcin Tybura at UFC Fight Night London. But I love this fight for Mick Parkin. He's making such a big leap up, fighting a guy who is ranked pretty solidly in that heavyweight division, but he hasn't had that graded approach through the lower end of the rankings yet. I think this is a fight that a defeat doesn't do him a huge amount of damage, but victory does him a huge amount of good. The upside far outweighs the downside for Mick Parkin. And fresh off that bonus winning performance against Lucas Dresky in Manchester at UFC 304, you know that Parkin is going to be very confident heading into that one. Training out of an absolutely legit gym up there, up north in England, with the likes of Aspinall, with the likes of KSW champion Phil DeFries. He's got all the expertise, experience and knowledge that he needs to continue to develop his game. And we were lucky enough to grab a cup of coffee with him after his bonus winning performance in Manchester. And he was absolutely in dreamland to hear that he'd got his bonus. Now it's time to kick on. He's had his first few wins in the UFC. He's just had his first big fight night bonus. Now he wants to gate crash the UFC rankings. If he beats Marcin Tybura on March the 22nd, he'll have done it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how Mick levels up as he fights on home soil, looking to gate crash the upper echelons of the UFC heavyweight division. Also already booked for UFC London, a light heavyweight fight between Alonzo Menifield and Oumar Sy. I love this matchmaking. Alonzo Menifield, big, strong, powerful. We all know what he brings to the table. An absolute specimen of a human being. Ranked 15th, right at the bottom of that UFC light heavyweight rankings. But he's coming off back-to-back losses. He needs to turn his form around. He's taking on unranked opposition in the form of Oumar Sy. But Oumar Sy is a savage. He's had 2 fights. He joined the UFC this year. He's had 2 fights. He's won them both, and he's looked good doing it. Another one of these fights coming out of France. UFC are obviously looking to tap into that French market a bit more, and he's someone who they can really sort of hang their flag on, if you like. Oumar Sy is going to be a contender at 205 pounds. The big question is, how quickly will he become a contender? He has the opportunity on March 22nd to gate crash the rankings, move into a ranked spot, and then start to set his sights on the big names in that 205 pound division. We already said just how wide open that light heavyweight division is, and it really is. It really is wide open, and we've now got a new crop of prospects and contenders looking to move their way in. We saw Navajo Sterling at the weekend, someone who maybe in the next few months, he's going to be looking to break into the rankings. We've got Carlos Ulberg at the same City Kickboxing Gym. He's obviously right up there in the rankings now. He's going to be taking on Jan Blachowicz on this fight card in London on March the 22nd. And here we have Oumar Sy looking to break himself into the light heavyweight rankings as well. Really good matchup this. Looking forward to this. Menifield's got to defend his ranking against a dangerous man. Oumar Sy wants to get himself in the mix. That is going to be must-see TV when those two get in the octagon in March. And the 6th confirmed fight for UFC Fight Night London, Shauna Bannon versus Puja Tomar. Two fighters who are both coming off the back of their first UFC victories, both won them by split decision. Now one of them will come out of this fight on a 2-fight win streak. Huge opportunity for both women. Bannon lost her octagon debut to Bruna Brazil back in July of 2023. She bounced back with a win over Alice Ardalian at UFC 304 in Manchester. She's taken on Tomar, who 5-fight win streak overall, picked up her debut UFC victory last time out with a split decision win. One of these women is going to be on a 2-fight win streak coming out of UFC Fight Night London. Will it be Shauna Bannon? Will it be Puja Tomar? We will find out on March the 22nd. All right, so that's 6 fights locked and loaded for UFC Fight Night London on March the 22nd, 2025. That means we've got pretty much half a fight card still to be announced. We'll say 6 fights, about 12 fights on a UFC Fight Night card sounds just about right. Let's talk about booking some fantasy matches here. Let's do some fantasy matchmaking here on the RDX Sports Podcast. But before we move into the fights that I've kind of earmarked as potential bouts that I'd like to see on this card, let's talk about a couple of British fighters that, while normally we'd love to see them in action on this fight card, I'm not so sure we're going to see them. I don't think we're going to see Paddy Pimblett necessarily on this London Fight Night card. I think at this stage in his career, he either needs to be headlining the card, which is a possibility, but I think with the main event that I've got earmarked, I don't think that will be a main event for Paddy. So Paddy's not going to be headlining. I think he's going to be better served in a main card matchup on a pay-per-view card. Use his star power that he undoubtedly has and get him in there with another big name in the lightweight division, the fight that everybody's been talking about, that they're hoping to see, including both fighters, is Paddy Pimblett versus Renato Moicano. Moicano is going to be facing Beneil Dariush at UFC 311 in January. I think once we get through that fight, we then know what direction the UFC are going to want to take Renato Moicano. Will they look to book the pair of them as opposing coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, which is an idea that Paddy has pitched, and I think is a great idea. I think the pair of them coaching tough would be hilarious and would actually make the series even more watchable. But even if they were just booking it as a matchup, I think that fight sells, whether it's Moicano coming off a win or coming off a loss. Arguably, Moicano coming off a loss makes that fight even more bookable. I think 'cause if he wins, he's going to be looking up the rankings rather than down the rankings. So we'll see how Moicano does at UFC 311 against Beneil Dariush, and then we'll know what's going to happen with Paddy after that. I would imagine that will be the fight that they're targeting for Paddy Pimblett, but we shall see. There will be a contingency in place, I'm sure. But because of that, I'm not so sure we will see him on the fight card in London on March 22nd. I could be wrong, but that's just my suspicion. Another fighter who, just from the way that things are shaking out, I would expect to see him on a US-based card rather than here in the UK, is Manchester's Leroy Murphy. He's still undefeated. He's right up there in the featherweight rankings, and he's an absolute nightmare matchup for anybody at 145 pounds. The question is, how are they going to matchmake him now? Because he's hitting that sort of cusp of top contender status. He says, "I'll put my teeth back in." But it's going to be, this next fight is a huge one for Leroy Murphy. And I think because of that, it's likely to be a fight night headliner, possibly in the US, or maybe a supporting fight on a main card of a pay-per-view. Taking a look at the potential options for him, I think there are 2 natural fighters for him, looking at where he sits in the rankings. I think Calvin Kattar is an option for him, but the one that I really think makes the most sense is a fight that I think he asked for after his last fight, and that's about with Josh Emmett. I think the way that they're both set in their careers at the moment, that fight makes a lot of sense for both of them, and I could see that fight getting added either to a US Fight Night card or a pay-per-view event a little bit further down the line. You could book that for London on March the 22nd. I just have a feeling that they will hold that one back and perhaps put that on a card in the United States, but we shall see. But for the purposes of this fantasy matchmaking exercise that I'm doing here, that's why I don't have Paddy on that list. That's why I don't have Leroy on that list. I would love to see both of them. Being completely selfish, I would love to see both of them on the fight card. Being able to see both those guys uh, two hugely talented UK fighters fighting on home soil would be fantastic. I just think with this being a fight night card, I think they will look to deploy those guys where they can perhaps give them a little bit more bang for their buck, given that this card is already going to be stacked with Brits anyway. But we shall see as we move into 2025. They're two of the fighters that I think might not be on the card. Let's take a look through some of the fights that maybe could be on the fight card for London on March the 22nd at the O2. And we'll kind of try and work our way up towards a main event. Let's look at the flyweight division. Lonnie Kavanagh, he's based in London. He trains at a GB top team under UK MMA legend and Dana White's favourite fighter, as was Brad One Punch Pickett, training with him and Ash Grimshaw in Morden, London at GB top team. Absolute stellar talent at 125 pounds. The big question with him is just how quickly do you push him? Because the flyweight division, a bit like the light heavyweight division, wide open. A couple of big wins and you could be right in there in contention in that division. So if you're Lonnie Kavanagh, it's going to be interesting to see how they book you. For me, I've had a look through the list. I don't think you throw him straight in with a ranked opponent yet. He's only one fight into his UFC career. Let's build him in. Let's put him in there with someone who's been in there with some experienced guys. He's won some, he's lost some, but it allows you to set a benchmark for where Kavanagh currently sits in that 125-pound division. And I think an ideal opponent will be someone like Malcolm Gordon. Gordon, he's been in there with the likes of Mohamed Mokaev. He's been in there with the likes of Jake Hadley. And yeah, he's lost to both of those guys. But by looking to see how someone like Lonnie does against him compared to those two will help benchmark him alongside the rest of that flyweight division. And just having him on the card is a no-brainer. He is an absolute human highlight reel. You put him there early on in the fight night. You know you're going to get a load of London-based fans in the building early. Helps build the crowd atmosphere in the O2. No-brainer booking. Get Lonnie Kavanagh on that fight card. Malcolm Gordon, I think, is a really solid opponent for him. Super experienced. He's been in there with a lot of experienced names himself. That'll be a good test for Lonnie Kavanagh on what would be his second fight in the UFC. From someone who is having his second fight in the UFC to someone who has had an absolute plethora of fights in the UFC and almost every single one of them was a banger, is someone who we haven't seen in a little while, and I'm really looking forward to seeing him back, and I really hope they book him for this event. And that's Danny Roberts. Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts has been a bit of an unsung hero for the UK in the UFC over the years. He's won a few, he's lost a few, but every time he fights, he absolutely gives everything he has, and the fights are invariably absolute crackers. You know, I think back to his fight with Mike Perry. Yeah, he lost that fight, but my goodness me, what a fight that was. If you haven't seen that fight, get on UFC Fight Pass and search for Danny Roberts versus Mike Perry at UFC. When was it? UFC 204, I think it was. I think it was the Michael Bisping card in Manchester. My goodness gracious me, what a fight that was. A bloody war. I think if you ask Mike Perry, I think he'll tell you as well. That was probably one of his most favourite fights in the UFC. Absolute cracker of a matchup. Let's get Danny Roberts back in circulation. I know he's looking to work his way back to full fitness. He's looking to get back in the cage in 2025. We haven't seen him in a little while. I think by the time it gets to March, it'll be about 18 months since he's been in the cage. So let's get him in there. But who do you put him in there with? Danny Roberts is on a 3-fight skid. So we need to put him in there with someone who potentially is on a similar sort of run of form to him. But ideally, you want to put him in there with someone with a similar sort of fighting style as him, so you can really generate an exciting, fan-friendly fight that will bring the best out of both men. And I think we saw the perfect opponent for Danny just a few weeks ago. James Llontop from Peru put on an absolute war with Mauricio Hufi a few weeks ago. And I think that Llontop's fighting style would mesh absolutely perfectly with Danny Roberts. I think the pair of them would serve up an absolute barn burner of a fight at 170 pounds. I have no idea who will win that fight. It's going to be just whoever's left standing at the end, or whoever's managed to inflict the most damage by the end of that fight. That will be an absolute cracker. I'd love to see that fight. Both men need a win. Both men love to stand and bang. Book the fight. To me, that is an absolute slam dunk booking. even if I say so myself. But Danny Roberts, I'd love to see Danny Roberts back in there. I know he took that last defeat very, very hard. That was a tough one for him to lose last time out. That was in London. For him to bounce back in London would, I think, be the perfect sort of full circle moment for him. He's in the veteran stage of his career, and I think every win at this stage will be absolutely priceless for him. And I'm sure that he would love nothing more than to step back in the octagon at the O2 and deliver the goods in front of the UK fight fans once again. Let's take a look at another fighter who we've seen quite recently, very recently, this weekend, in fact. Dangerous Davey Grant, UK bantamweight, one of the nicest guys in MMA, came out of his win this weekend, and his feet were absolutely mangled. Apparently, there was some damage before the fight, but they were well and truly ripped to pieces by the end of the fight. So that puts a big question mark over what I'm about to suggest, how quickly that could all be, because he's going to need his toes stitched back together and all this sort of stuff. So it really depends on how quick that healing process is. Feet are a tricky area to deal with at the best of times. The skin, certainly between the toes, is very, very delicate. I don't know how quick the healing process would be in somewhere like that, where your feet are just moving around all the time, unless he just puts himself in a boot or something and just doesn't, just immobilizes his toes for a while. It's going to take a while for all of that to heal up. Then he's got to get back into training. So maybe March might come a little early. I hope it doesn't, because I'd love to see Davey back in the cage right here in the UK. He picked up a win, obviously, at the weekend. Very, very hard-earned win. Great performance for him. Who does he fight against, though? Who do we put him against? He's outside of the bantamweight rankings. I think he probably needs to either face someone who's just inside the bantamweight rankings or someone else who's just outside, who maybe was recently in the bantamweight rankings, to then springboard him into a fight with a top 15 opponent later in the year. And I've found two names that I think fit the bill perfectly. Ricky Simone is the first one. Ricky's on a bit of a tricky run of form himself, formerly ranked at 135 pounds, always brings the action, always exciting to watch. And I think stylistically, a Davey Grant-Ricky Simone fight would be a great matchup. If he's fit and ready to go, and if Davey can get himself fit and ready to go, I love that matchup. The only downside to that, maybe if you're the UFC matchmakers, is you've got a guy coming off a win versus a guy coming off, I think, 3 straight losses. It's a little lopsided. So if you don't want to go that route, why not go Jonathan Martinez? Jonathan Martinez, admittedly, is coming off a loss. He lost a decision to Marcus McGee just a few weeks back in a fight that, if you ever watch Jonathan Martinez's fights, you would have been quite puzzled watching how that fight panned out. Martinez is an outstanding striker. His leg kicks are some of the best you'll see in any of the weight classes. And for reasons that I think only he will be able to explain, he abandoned his biggest weapon just as it was starting to really turn the fight in his favour. He had McGee hobbling, he had him in big trouble, and I think a TKO due to leg kicks was on the table for him in that fight against McGee. For some reason, he didn't pull the trigger with the leg kicks. He ended up losing the decision. But Martinez is a dangerous fighter. He's just outside those bantamweight rankings as well. And I think either Ricky Simone or Jonathan Martinez would represent a really good style matchup and a relevant matchup for Davey Grant. That's 3 guys, all of whom are more than capable of being a top 15 UFC bantamweight and have been top 15 UFC bantamweights in the past. Now, victory for either one of them, put 2 of them together, the winner would surely get a shot against ranked opposition later in 2025. So fingers crossed for Davey that those pretty horrific images we saw of his feet made things look a lot worse than they actually were, and that he can heal himself up nice and quickly and get himself back in there in time for a March return. And if he does, Ricky Simone or Jonathan Martinez would be my pick. Either one of those would be a cracker for UFC Fight Night London. All right, this fight card for UFC Fight Night London is starting to take shape now. We've got some cracking fights already booked. We've had a few fantasy fights that we've just added. Let's start to build out the top of this fight card, shall we? And an absolute cracker at 145 pounds. It's a London fight card, boys and girls. Nathaniel Wood has to be on this card. He is, I think, geographically, the most local fighter the UFC has for a fight card in London. A London boy, trains at a GB top team with Brad Pickett. We've already put Lonnie Kavanagh on the card. Let's put Nathaniel Wood on the card. They can both train together, build up for the fight together, get them on that fight card. Nathaniel Wood, unranked at 145 pounds, but in a similar vein to Davey Grant we just mentioned before, always brings excitement, always brings fun performances, and he's just outside of that top 15 bracket. He needs to fight someone with a name, someone else who maybe isn't quite in that top 15 bracket, but is also looking upwards the same as him. And having had a look at the division, there's no shortage of options for him, but the one that leapt off the page to me was Super Sodiq Yusuff. I think Super Sodiq Yusuff would be an absolutely incredible fight for the fans in London. I think it's a fight that would appeal to both men. I think both men would relish the opportunity to test themselves against the other. Both prefer to stand and strike. Both also have the ability to mix things up on the mat if needed. But from a stylistic standpoint, I think it's a cracker of a matchup at 145 pounds. Nathaniel Wood last time out defeated Daniel Pineda at UFC 304. He's won 4 of his last 5. He's picking up some steam now at 145 pounds, having moved up to bantamweight a couple of years ago. Sodiq Yusuff's form not quite as good, but you have to consider the strength of schedule, right? He's been in there with higher grade opposition. He's had 3 losses out of his last 5, but those 3 losses came to Arnold Allen, Edson Barboza, and Diego Lopez. We're talking top drawer opposition for Sodiq Yusuff, and he was competitive in all 3 fights. So we need to bear that in mind. This is a big fight for Arnold Allen if they were to book him against Sodiq Yusuff. Yusuff, I think, is someone who, skill-wise, absolutely belongs in the top 15. I just think he hasn't been able to pick up that run of results in succession that would put him in there. But quality-wise, there's no doubt he's a world-class 145-pounder. And Nathaniel Wood, former bantamweight champion in Cage Warriors, now really seeming to find his feet and hit his best form in the UFC, having moved up to 145 pounds, where he's not the biggest guy in the weight class, but he's fighting at his natural weight. And how many times have we seen when fighters are fighting at their natural weight, that is when you get their best performances. It's not when they're the biggest guy in the cage, it's when they're the freshest guy in the cage. And we're seeing that with Nathaniel Wood. Great performance from him last time out, and a bout with Sodiq Yusuff, I think would be a potential fight of the night contender. That would be an absolute cracker for the main card. I'd put that on the main card at UFC Fight Night London this coming March. All right, we have reached the sharp end of the fight card as we try to fantasy book UFC Fight Night London in March 2025. We've got a jam-packed fight card already with the 6 fights that have already been booked by the UFC and the 4 that I've just fantasy booked just now. Let's add 2 more to the mix, and why not put them at the very top of the card? A co-main event and a main event. What that means is that light heavyweight fight between Jan Blachowicz and Carlos Ulberg will sit in that 3rd slot on the main card. And if these 2 fights get booked to go above it, then we've really got a loaded lineup for March the 22nd. So let's go to the featherweight division, 145 pounds. Arnold Almighty Allen against Aljamain, the Funk Master, Sterling. I had this fight written down a couple of weeks ago when I knew that I was going to do this podcast. I wrote that one down. That's actually the first fight I put down as a matchup that I thought that makes so much sense. That would be a perfect booking for UFC Fight Night London. And then just a couple of days ago, Aljamain Sterling himself calls for a fight with Arnold Allen in London. It's he sees it. It's a perfect matchup. Arnold Allen isn't the sort of person to turn around and go, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm not going to take that." It's a fight that makes sense. It's a fight that makes sense for Aljo. It's a fight that makes sense for Arnold. And I think that it's a fight that fits perfectly on that UK fight card. Aljamain Sterling, a great character, top bloke. I had the chance to meet him when I think it was in Gdansk, Poland. I think he was a guest fighter in Poland. I had the chance to meet him when he was over for that. Really lovely guy. The perfect sort of away fighter, if you like, to put on UK soil. he'll roll with the banter a little bit with the UK. He'll get a little bit of stick from the UK fans, but because it's Aljo, it will all be good-natured. He'll give a little bit back. The Brits will love that. I think it's a great matchup. I think it'll be a fun build-up between those two. And stylistically, I think it's a great matchup. Arnold Allen loves to stand and trade. Aljamain Sterling is an elite grappler. However, Arnold Allen has excellent wrestling, good submission defense. Aljamain Sterling, his striking's getting better with every fight. I think there's a real clash of styles there. It'll be really interesting to watch. Also, both men have shared the cage with Movsar Evloev, and probably the pair of them have given Evloev his toughest test so far in the UFC. Both guys took him the distance. Both guys pushed him really hard in losing efforts. But I think they're probably the two guys that have really given Evloev his toughest days at the office so far. So I think, and then Aljo last time out against Evloev, I thought was outstanding. I thought that matchup was such a great bout to watch. MMA is not just about standing and banging and looking to knock people out. If you're any kind of fan of grappling, you couldn't fail to be entertained watching the way that those two were scrambling on the mat and the sort of the back and forth and the scrambles. I thought it was a real fun fight to watch. This will be a really interesting one if they book this. I think it makes sense for the division. I think whoever wins this is right up there within touching distance of the top 2 or 3 in the weight class. I think it makes all sense for everybody. I think for Sterling, it's a huge opportunity to beat an established contender and really say, hey, I'm here and I am a legit threat to the belt. And for Arnold Allen, it's an opportunity to potentially put the name of a UFC world champion on his list of victims and to prove that he deserves to be right up there with the very best in the division, as he has been in the last few years. So to me, I think that's a perfect co-main event matchup, and one that I think would sit beautifully on this UFC Fight Night London card on March the 22nd. And that brings us all to the main event of UFC Fight Night London, March 22nd, O2 Arena. Who do we put in the main event? We already talked about Paddy Pimblett as someone who could headline a card like this, but we think that potentially he could be used elsewhere, whether it be via a season of The Ultimate Fighter or just put on a UFC pay-per-view in sort of like the co-main or number 3 slot. We've talked about Leroy Murphy, who in terms of his standing and his undefeated record is someone who could potentially carry a main event. He maybe doesn't have the star power of some of the other fighters in the division, or some of the other UK fighters, but ability-wise, there is no questioning that man's ability. I just think that, again, they're probably going to look to use him in a supporting role on a main card somewhere, or maybe on a US-based fight night where his opponent will carry a lot of the load. So we'll see how that all goes. But the main event here, for me, it has to be Leon Edwards. It has to be Leon Edwards, recently deposed as welterweight champion, lost at UFC 304. It's hard to say anything other than that was a bad day at the office for Leon Rocky Edwards. He didn't look like the same Leon that we'd seen in his previous title fights. Something wasn't quite right for him there. And that's not to detract from Belal Muhammad's performance. He put in the perfect fight performance in order to win the belt. He did everything right. But was Leon at 100% in that fight? Did he execute the way that you would have expected him to? He didn't. And I think that he's going to be looking to bounce back with a point to prove, and putting him in the main event of UFC London gives him the opportunity and the stage to make that statement and say, hey, I'm going nowhere. I'm still the number 1 contender in this division. But in order to do that, he needs the right level of opponent. And you start looking down that welterweight division, and the options are a little bit thin. You take a look at it. He's number 1 in the welterweight division. Number 2 is Shavkat Rakhmonov. He's just defeated Ian Machado Gary and is now in line to challenge for the title in 2025. Ranked number 3 is Kamaru Usman, who Leon has already fought 3 times and beaten him twice in his last 2. That fight doesn't make an enormous amount of sense right now. Plus, Usman, I think, may be getting booked against someone else, more of which in a minute. So that means it's either number 4 ranked Jack Della Maddalena, or number 5 ranked Sean Brady? Realistically, it's got to be one of those two guys if we're keeping Leon as relevant as possible at the top of that welterweight division. However, UFC 312 is taking place in Australia. That means Jack Della is probably, almost certainly, going to be heavily involved on that card, and there are strong rumours linking him with a fight with Kamaru Usman at that event. So that being the case, that takes both of those names off the board. The name that remains is Sean Brady, and I think that is probably what we're likely to get. I think we could well get Leon Edwards, Sean Brady as the main event. It's a big fight for both men. I think it's an interesting test for both men, especially what happened with Leon against Belal, where Belal really had his own way with him in terms of the wrestling. And that's where Sean Brady really shines. He's got the wrestling, he's got the grappling once it hits the mat. That's going to be a real test for Leon coming off the back of that Belal Muhammad performance. So that makes that particularly interesting. On the flip side, Leon will fancy himself strongly in the stand-up exchanges. Sean Brady is decent on the feet, but he's not Leon Edwards level on the feet. So I think that's a really interesting one. I think if the fight hits the mat, you're in Sean Brady country. If the fight's on the feet, we are very much in Leon Edwards country. This is going to be an interesting fight. If they book it, I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're Sean Brady, he deserves a shot against a top-level contender, someone who he can really push his title claims against. And if he gets past Leon, there's no denying the man. If you're Leon, you want to face the most relevant, most highly ranked, most dangerous opponent you could possibly face in order to right the ship, put yourself right back on top again and say, hey, I'm still here. That was a bad day at the office in Manchester at UFC 304. I'm coming back. And then if Belal gets past Shavkat, the rematch is there for him. If Shavkat wins, then Leon could potentially be next in line to challenge Shavkat in what would be his first title defense. But for me, it's a booking that it's really a process of elimination, I think, for Leon. I think once you get below Sean Brady, we're looking at people like Gilbert Burns, who, from a stylistic point of view, would be a fun fight. But I don't know what that fight does for Leon in terms of his standing in the division. It certainly doesn't make an enormous statement, I don't think, because there are so many people ranked above Gilbert in the division. I think if he takes the highest ranked available fighter, and on paper that looks like it's probably going to be Sean Brady, then I think that's the fight that he needs to have. And I suspect that will be the fight that we get at the top of the fight card for March the 22nd. Now, these are all my personal matchmaking selections that I've come up with. I've tried to be as realistic and as sensible as possible. Tried not to go off the wall too much or chuck anything completely random in there. I'd love to know what you think about these matchups. Who would you book for UFC Fight Night London? Given what we already have and given the amount of room that we've got on the fight card, at the time of recording this, we have 6 fights booked, which means you've probably got 6, maybe if we're lucky, 7 more to add to that fight card for March. Who do you want to see on that fight card? Another name that I missed off, Tom Aspinall. We all know why that is. He needs to be fighting a certain Mr. John Bones Jones, ideally at Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas in International Fight Week. Will that happen? Who the hell knows at this point? But Tom Aspinall is not going to be on this card at UFC Fight Night London. So he'll be there, I'm sure, as part of the TNT Sports crew. But that's why he's not on this fight card. This is a get-back fight for Leon Rocky Edwards. And I think this is an opportunity for him to prove that last time out was just a bad day at the office. We all have them. But Leon Edwards is going to look to prove that he's back and that he's right back there in the welterweight title mix heading in to the middle part of 2025. Let us know who you would book for that fight card. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the RDX Sports Podcast via this here YouTube channel, the RDX Sports YouTube channel. You can follow me on the socials at Simon Head Sport across all the different social channels, whether it be X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, whatever you want to call it. I'm on them all at Simon Head Sport. And don't forget, check out RDX Sports combat sports coverage at blogs.rdxsports.com. That's all we've got for you on the RDX Sports Podcast as we head towards the holiday season. For everybody out there, have a great Christmas, Have a great holiday season, and we will catch up with you in a week or so's time. We might take a break for Christmas, but we will be back after Christmas as we look ahead to 2025 and a lot more fights coming down the line. Have a great holiday period, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon.